Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Red Light Exposé. My name is Andrea Heinz, and I am one of 9 hosts here at this podcast project, which aims to debunk sex work ideology and raise awareness of the harms of commercial sexual exploitation. In 2013, at age 29, I exited the licensed prostitution system here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, after 7 years of involvement, and became a staunch abolitionist of the sex industry in all its forms. For the purpose of this conversation today, it's important that I mention that I've also been vegan for the last 4 years, after realizing that all forms of animal exploitation also require an abolition-focused response. When we talk about exploitation, we often think about it in silos: human trafficking, prostitution, pornography, or separately, the use of animals for food, fashion, or entertainment. But what if these systems are all connected by the same underlying logic, the idea that some bodies exist for others' use? And if that's the case, then how should we change our attitudes and behaviors going forward? Here with me today to discuss the interconnectedness of exploitation is someone I admire and respect very deeply, Professor Gary Francione, a pioneer of the abolitionist approach to animal rights. Gary Francione is a professor emeritus of law and philosophy at Rutgers University, as well as an honorary professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia and the University of Lincoln. In addition, he is also a philosophy tutor at the University of Oxford, Division of Continuing Education. Professor Francione has been a vegan for over 40 years and has authored numerous books on the topic, including The Animal Rights Debate, Abolition or Regulation, and his most recent book, Why Veganism Matters: The Moral Value of Animals. Together, we're going to explore how the ethics of non-exploitation apply universally across species, across industries, and across the false boundaries we draw between human and non-human suffering. We'll talk about moral consistency, the myths that sustain exploitation, and what it might take to build a world where no one, human or animal, is for sale. Welcome, Professor. It's truly an honor to have you here. When our group formed this podcast in 2023, you were one of the first people I had on my wish list of guests. I think the work you have done to raise the collective conscience around veganism as a moral imperative and an unequivocal moral baseline is unmatched and incredibly remarkable. And I have watched every single one of your lectures online and enjoyed them immensely. I know you're a very, very busy person, so to be given this time with you today is really special for me. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm delighted. My only question is, if I was on your wish list in 2023, why did it take you this long to get to me?
Well, we're busy people. You're not the only busy one, right? I know. I've been kicking myself repeatedly asking that same question.
Actually, it's a mutual admiration because I really love your work. I have been so saddened by this movement of young people who want to talk about sex work and who regard prostitution as something that isn't terribly exploitative. When I came across you and I got your book and I read it, which I actually found very difficult to read the thing, because it's really embarrassing to be a male, because you realize you're responsible for all of this nonsense. And it really is embarrassing. And so I'm really glad that there's some young people out there now who are really sort of and I'm sure you get a lot of pushback too, because there's also a lot of young people who think that prostitution is really admirable and it's sex work and we ought to have unions and we ought to do this, and and that's just crazy. Anyway, I'm delighted to be with you. So thank you for finally getting to me.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for calling me a young person. I'm 42 years old, so I appreciate that.
Sister, that's young.
We won't tell your age, but listeners, he doesn't look his age. I can see him on camera here. He doesn't look it. So yeah. Well, thanks again, Professor. And so maybe before we dive into the parallels between commercial sex and animal exploitation, or shared both separate and intertwined causes, I think, perhaps we can start with having you define veganism as you understand it within your abolitionist framework. And then maybe after that, I will offer a working definition of commercial sexual exploitation so that both we and the listeners can have some shared terms as we move forward.
Well, veganism for me has sort of a behavioral element and then a theoretical or ideas element. The behavioral element is just you choose not to eat or otherwise use animals in any situation in which you've got a meaningful choice. Anytime you can choose, you choose not to exploit. But the reason why you make that choice is because you recognize that animal exploitation is predicated on the grounds that animals are property and that they're things. They have no inherent moral value. They have only economic value. Animals are property. Remember that. All over the world, in the United States and Canada, in every place. Animals are property. They're chattel. They have only economic value. And once you realize that's what it is, and you say, that's not right, I have to reject that. When you reject that, you reject the whole basis of animal exploitation, because the whole foundation of it is predicated on this idea that animals are property. And people don't really understand this. Their mind goes to the fact that they've got dogs or cats and they regard their dogs and cats as members of their family. I mean, I get this all the time. On social media, people say, oh, I don't regard my animals as property. They're members of my family. No, they're your property. If you want, you can assign a high value to them and give them a great life. If you don't value them highly, you can keep them chained out in your backyard and use them as guard dogs. Or, when I lived in New York City, there were shops all over the place. They had cats. The cats were never fed. They were kept in the store to get rid of rodents. You can never show them any affection. You can just give them minimal food, water, and shelter. And as long as you give them minimal food, water, and shelter, you're pretty much okay. And even if you don't, it's unlikely you're going to get prosecuted anyway. But the bottom line is animals are our property. I love my animals. I regard them as members of my family. But that's no different from saying I love my car and I wash it every week and I wax it and I take care of it and I fetishize it or whatever. They're our property. We can value them high. We can value them low. And we can do that because they're our property. I can take my dogs. I have 4 dogs in this house right now. I could put my dogs in a car. I could take them to the vet and I could say, put them to sleep, kill them because I don't wish to own them anymore. I could take them to a shelter that kills animals. They say euthanize. Euthanize is not the right word. Euthanize is when killing is in the interest of the being. Killing is never in the interest of a healthy being. And you sign your property over to the shelter and they'll kill your animal if they can't find another home. And once you understand that structure and you say, that's really unjust, that can't be justified, I reject that. I do not believe they should be regarded as property. And therefore, I will not eat them, wear them, use them. I'm just not going to participate in that level of exploitation. So for me, veganism is a moral imperative. It's what you do when you realize that we have this unjust structure of animals as chattel property. And once you recognize that and recognize that it cannot be justified, then you simply stop participating in it. Where my position differs from that of 99% of what we call the animal movement is that they would say, well, eat cage-free eggs or eat crate-free pork. That's nonsense. If it's wrong to do, you don't look for a right way to do the wrong thing. Because they're property and because it costs so much money to protect their interests, all of the supposedly humane stuff that you buy at the store is all the product of torture anyway. You're just deluding yourself if you think that there's any sort of real difference between the conventional food and the higher welfare food. This is all just a marketing technique for these large animal groups. You don't participate in it because you think it's wrong to treat non-human animals as commodities. You recognize that every aspect of our use of them reflects the fact that we see them as nothing but commodities. Once you reject that, you've got no choice. You just stop participating in it. It's not a matter of loving animals. It's a matter of caring about justice.
Thank you so much. That was such a fulsome definition. And I like what you said about, I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but it tied into really what I have always seen as the definition of veganism is saying insofar as possible. People, they view this as some kind of extreme position to take, but I don't think it is extreme. It's just, as you said, recognizing that there's an injustice and doing everything that you can to avoid being part of the problem. And that doesn't always mean that you can always avoid it. Obviously, certain medications that people may require have not advanced enough to move beyond animal testing or animal products. But it's insofar as possible doing what you can to avoid impacting animals in any type of way with your daily activity.
You just want to stop participating in animal exploitation to the extent that you can. And when I say to the extent that you have a meaningful choice, when I decide what I'm going to eat for dinner tonight, it's not a question of, well, I don't really have a choice because I really want to have a steak. And the answer is no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is, do you have a meaningful choice? I would rather go without eating. If I was in a place where there was nothing I could get that was vegan, I'm capable of going without a meal. I'm not going to die. When I buy clothes, I don't buy wool. I don't certainly buy leather. When I buy shampoo and stuff like that, I just get stuff that doesn't have animal products. I'm not really sure. I mean, the testing thing is a little more difficult because once you get beyond what's in the product, it starts getting a little bit difficult. I remember some years ago, there was a company that makes this vegan cheese, and they got acquired by some other company that did something else and had animal testing. And people said, well, this product is no longer vegan because it's owned by a corporation that does some animal testing. But that's like saying you've got a company and they make vegan products, but they allow their employees to bring animal products to lunch with them and stuff like that. I mean, the problem is it's pervasive. And I think the only way you can meaningfully address it is in terms of what people eat, what they wear. Even though you can buy things that are not tested, the individual things would have been tested at some point. So, it's not trying to sort of eradicate every aspect of the exploitation because you can't. People say, well, you're so extreme about it. And I'm not extreme about it. If you take it seriously, when you have choices to make, you choose the non-violent, non-animal choice,
Well, I appreciate that definition, and I'll give one for commercial sexual exploitation, just for both ourselves and the listeners. Commercial sexual exploitation is the use of any person in sexual activities or sexually explicit performances in exchange for money, goods, services, or other material benefits. It occurs when participation is shaped by coercion, manipulation, power imbalance, or economic vulnerability, such that genuine, freely given sexual consent is compromised. So, in simple terms, commercial sexual exploitation is the commercialization of sexual activity under conditions that exploit vulnerability rather than reflect autonomous choice. So, I guess with these definitions in mind, and you've touched on it already a little bit here, do you see these two phenomena, animal exploitation and sexual exploitation, as manifestations of a common ethical problem?
Oh, sure. Commodification. I mean, it's commodification of the other, whether it's the human other or the non-human other. I think the problem with sexual activities is we live in a misogynistic, sexist culture. It's around us. It's like air. We don't notice it anymore. And you can segment off and talk about prostitution, but what do you do about the fact that women are constantly in situations where one could legitimately ask, is there consent there? I have a lot of female friends, and I don't know many of them at all who would say that they've never had a non-consensual sexual experience. Some of them more so, where they've had overt sexual assaults and stuff like that. But women have been in situations where power imbalance, which is inherent in sexism, it's inherent in patriarchy. I find it very frustrating that we don't talk about this stuff. We don't recognize that it's not just that we have institutions like prostitution and pornography or whatever. It's that we have a social structure where women are seen primarily as providers of sexual services, where their entire lives are shaped by that.
Yeah, in one way or another.
Even if they're not engaged in, quote, sex work, their lives are still being shaped. So I have always thought that we'll never understand the animal question as long as we are not confronting the problem of sexism and misogyny, which I don't think we do very well, to be honest with you. And it goes well beyond prostitution or whatever you want to call sex work. It goes beyond that. Every interaction we have in our society is shaped by the power dynamics of patriarchy. I find it really sort of overwhelming in certain ways to think about.
I'm with you on that. And I can't tell you how refreshing it is anytime that I sit down and speak with men that see this. Because the amount of gaslighting, and I know that guaranteed you get that in the vegan sphere as well too, of activism, right? But the amount of gaslighting that you get of people saying, well, this is unrealistic. This is too extreme. This is like comparing apples and oranges when you're talking about certain segments of exploitation. So, you've got prostitution, which they separate from sex work, and then sex work, which they separate from trafficking, and trafficking and sex work and all those things, which they separate from sugar daddying. There's always these hoops that people jump through to try to go around, I guess, the issue of the reality of exactly what you said, that it's just overall unjust what we're talking about. And because we have done so many of these loop-de-loops mentally, we've really lost this core understanding in society of what is just and what is not. Of all the gaslighting, all the, hoop jumping, we've really watered down our common collective consciousness on issues to be able to look at things and say, that's just not right. Like, that's exploitation. And you can recognize those things just with your gut and how you feel and, obviously what your eyes show you. But I think when people benefit from it, there's a very strong resistance to sitting with themselves and examining their thoughts and their perceptions of things. And so it's much easier, as you know, to go on the defense and argue against something than try to really go inside yourself and say, well, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I looked at this the wrong way for many years, and maybe there's room for me to grow or change. So I'm wondering, how do you respond to critics who call animal abolition unrealistic or too extreme? Like, how do you reach those people? Can they even be reached?
Some of them can be reached. A lot of them can't be reached. I long ago gave up on the idea that the right side is going to prevail. I don't think of it in those terms anymore about winning. And, the answer is that's the wrong question. Getting up every day is an existential challenge to all of us as to how we're going to live that day, what we're going to do, what values we're going to bring to our lives. With respect to veganism, I'm always being told, well, you're too extreme. And I said, what's extreme about it? What's extreme is I encounter people every day of my life, including today. I was talking with somebody. People constantly tell, I love animals. I love animals. I love animals. Do you eat them? Yes. Why?
Yeah, does not make sense.
It doesn't make sense. The last book that I wrote, Why Veganism Matters, the whole thesis of that book was veganism isn't extreme. What's extreme is not being a vegan, saying you care about animals and not being a vegan. If you say you care about animals, then you're not a vegan. The problem is with your thinking, not with mine. I'm simply being consistent. I think animals matter, by which I mean simply that they have a value beyond being commodities. I'm not suggesting that we open the cages and let them all run wild. They can't, but they're domesticated animals. What I'm saying is if we stop consuming them, then the demand for them will go down. And then eventually we'll just have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer animals. And then eventually we won't have domesticated animals. And to be honest with you, because somebody will pick up on this and think that I'm being inconsistent, so I want to anticipate that. They say, well, you have dogs. And the answer is, yeah, I have dogs. I've had 26, Anna and I have had 26 rescue dogs so far. I love them dearly. They've taught me enormous amounts about life. And if I had a choice, they wouldn't exist. I don't believe we should have domesticated animals. They're completely dependent on us for everything about, they require that we intervene in their lives to feed them, to give them water. We control their lives and we breed them because they are submissive. And we value them for their submissiveness, which raises for me a very serious problem. And so I love them and I will continue to adopt them. But if it were up to me and there were 2 dogs left in the world, and I love dogs, you will never find anybody on the planet who likes hanging out with dogs more than I. If there were only 2 dogs left and it was up to me whether or not they would continue to breed so we could have pets, the answer would be not on your life. But we're not going to ever get there as long as we're eating them. So that the question of domesticated animals is down the road because we're never going to get there as long as we're continuing to eat them. I think in many ways, the non-vegans, most of whom think animals do matter morally. Most of them think that animals aren't things, that they may not be the same as humans. And I've never maintained that they are. There are significant differences.
I think they're better than humans. You'd probably agree.
Yeah, well, in certain ways they are. When people say, do you think an animal has the same value as a human? And the answer is, what the hell does that question even mean? When I say that all sentient beings are equal, what I mean is all sentient beings have interests in not suffering and interests in continuing to live, and that they are all equal in that we cannot justify treating them, human or non-human, exclusively as means to ends. And that doesn't mean they're all the same. You can have 2 humans. One is severely mentally compromised and one is a brilliant historian, and the university wants to hire a historian. Those 2 humans are not equally situated. You would not hire the person who was severely compromised mentally to be a historian because they would not be able to perform that role. But if the question is different, who do we use as a forced organ donor or as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment? the person with the cognitive impairment or the really smart person? The answer is you don't use either of them. And for purposes of using them exclusively as a means to an end, they're both equal. That is, using either of them would be equally bad as using the other. The one thing that is clear to me is we're not moving in the direction of more subtle thinking about important issues. We're just not. We don't read books anymore. We don't have discussions anymore. We relate to each other on social media, which is the most dysfunctional thing in the universe.
Yes.
And I mean, it really is. It's dysfunctional.
As we post this on social media.
Yeah. I mean, look, I participate in it too. I mean, there's a certain value in being able to reach large numbers of people. The problem is that nobody is thinking anymore, and they're just constantly boom, 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 reacting to this podcast or that post. We're in danger of not communicating with each other. And the problem is, in a patriarchal culture, in a misogynistic culture, women are always commodified on every level. And so you can say, well, commercial exploitation, sex exploitation is really bad. Sex work is really bad. What do you do about the young woman who's got the rich 85-year-old guy taking, I mean, that's obviously consensual in one sense, but there's something troubling about it because she's still a commodity because he's rich. He is able to buy. So just because the transaction is not discrete, she provides some service, he hands her money. She's providing a relationship and he's providing certain benefits. I think that gets really complicated. And it's only going to end when women are not financially dependent on men. See, that's the thing. Because the way the world is structured, women are constantly trying to fit into a male world where men have benefits that they dole out. Until the time when a woman who's being abused by a husband can say, screw it, I'm not putting up with this, and walk out, things aren't going to change.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that we're further ahead in women's equality, but we're also not, because I feel like it's been superficial to this point. Like, yes, now women have the right to vote. Yes, now women have the right of no-fault divorce. But we haven't really truly seen this materialize to a larger women's liberation from these oppressive systems as a result. I think that's just, the clutches of patriarchy that cling so tight. And now, we're starting to see this big red pill movement that's coming about because of that little bit of progress being made on the women's liberation front. So you're seeing repeal the 19th, so take away women's right to vote in America, or remove no-fault divorce, reproductive health access, forms of birth control, abortion access, things like that actually do lead women to have more meaningful options and choices in their lives where they could evade these systems of exploitation and control and patriarchal dominance. You start to see a little bit of progress happen, but then it's men are so well organized because women, we do all the lobbying, we do the grassroots feminism. So much of the social sector work at the NGO level is women, but then, you make a little bit of headway on pushing back against these patriarchal confines and boom, it's all the men in the world unite together and come down and tackle the work that women have done and take us back so far. And we've seen that in the gender ideology movement, 10 years of that, and women have lost access to their sex segregated spaces that they fought how many years for. We've seen that with the movement of sex work ideology and how that's really eroded all the work of anti-pornography, anti-prostitution feminists in the 70s and 80s, like what we were talking about earlier before we hit record. How are men this organized? Or is it just something in them that comes from entitlement that has been bred into them through the generations of living in patriarchy themselves that keeps a system going where we just don't seem to be making the headway? What do you think on that?
That's a tough question. I don't know the answer to it. I think it probably has something to do with the fact that we've got this entrenched entitlement. Look at what happened. We had second wave feminism, and it got squashed by this intersectional feminism, which is not feminism at all. What happened basically was second wave came, and it's terrified everybody, terrified men. And what you had was a reaction of, what I call third wave is Hugh Hefner feminism. Hugh Hefner was the publisher of Playboy magazine, and he used to always tell people he was a feminist, by which he meant he made women feel comfortable about walking around naked and being sex objects. That's not feminism. That is an ideology that feeds right into patriarchy. It's hey, feel comfortable about being exploited. Don't fight it. Just relax and enjoy it. And intersectional feminism now is not feminism at all. I see it as anti-feminism. And the trans ideology business is deeply troubling because it's an attempt to basically abolish women as a sex class and say that the way that we can control you best is to be members of your class. And then you stop existing as a sex class. So if you have a class of beings called women that are defined by their biology, and then you say, well, men can join that class, then you've abolished women as a sex class. I see it as deeply troubling. And what I find really upsetting is that it's so absurd, this idea I can be a woman. No, I can't be a woman. You can't be a man, Andrea. Sorry. And it's just the way it is. And this idea that we have these serious discussions, that governments and institutions buy into this stuff, it makes me think that, boy, I'm glad I'm a man, because women are on the edge of being annihilated every second. And I am always amazed that y'all haven't killed us. to be frank, I just don't understand it, how you've let us get away with this long.
Well, it's like what Andrea Dworkin said. It's not because there's any shortage of knives in the kitchen. It's because we see the humanity in men despite all the evidence that they've shown us, right? And we hold on to the hope. And sometimes, I think our downfall is that we come with too much empathy. And that's sad to say, because I think if the majority of men carried the empathy that you carry and other good men I know carry and women carry in general, the world would be a much, much better place. But until we kind of get there, sadly, women can't really come with that degree of empathy that we have, where we say, okay, well, if you identify as one of us, you can come into our rape shelters. And, that's okay that all these women here, have been victimized by male-bodied persons and, have been through the prostitution system. But hey, you don't feel safe, you come on in. Like, men are finding ways to usurp our movements to try to push back on patriarchy and male domination. And it's very alarming. And I think obviously another one of those strong ways is by championing this sex work ideology and saying, I'm a male feminist. I support sex work ideology. I support single moms. I go to the strip club and I pay them money. And without my money, they couldn't buy, food for their kids or school supplies for them. All this kind of stuff, where it's going back to what I said earlier about this twisted narrative that I just don't know what it's going to take to kind of get us back on track. And it just seems we're so far gone that sometimes I'm with you now, where I'm thinking, I don't know if we can really change this. It has to almost implode on itself through something even worse than what we have now before we'll really get people to snap out of this system of like cult-like thinking on these topics.
Well, look, the reality is, we'd be much better off with a matriarchy. We'd be much better off having women run things, because women don't default to violence. If women ran things, my guess is that we would have many fewer of the social problems that we have. That's the thing. The thing that's really odd is, you sort of equate males with rationality and women with emotion. I look at it completely differently. I think we are cauldrons of irrational thinking and energy and violence, and women sort of are rational, and they're able to sort of think through problems without defaulting to violence. I'm not sure it's going to get a hell of a lot better. I think what will happen is, look at the world right now. You've got a bunch of men in control of things, all of whom are threatening the other men, and they're all lobbing bombs around and doing this and doing that. And now there are nuclear bombs, so it's no longer just killing a few people. You can annihilate the entire planet. Do I think that will happen eventually? I think there are people who think that annihilating everybody is a great thing to do because it will give them satisfaction, and that worries me. I always say to my friends who have children, having kids is a real act of faith, because I cannot see how the hell this is going to get any better.
I guess we always hope that we will birth the one kid that will be the catalyst of change, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or we're just not thinking that far enough ahead, because I'd be lying if I didn't think many years ago the same thing before having children. And I remember having that conversation with my mother and going, I don't know, I've lived 30 years without being a parent. Like, do I need to do that now? And what about their future? And she said, well, we thought the exact same thing in the early 80s before we had you. So she said, it's a parent's fear, I think, at the end of the day, because the older you get, the more you get exposed to the reality and the dark sides of the world. And then you start to worry about what that means for your kids and your grandkids.
The reality is, generations back sort of thinking that the Rolling Stones were a real threat to civilization.
Yeah.
The times have changed, Andrea.
That is true. I see you getting dragged on Twitter. I'm sure you see me getting dragged on Twitter. And it's like just people being defensive, like I said, having a hard time looking at themselves. But I get that all the time. You want to impose everything on everyone else. I'm like, no, I just don't want somebody to be imposing violence on somebody. And again, I look at it through the objective reality that it is an unjust situation where violence is happening. But like I said, they're so far gone in their hoop jumping and gaslighting and rationalizations of things that they can't see that basic starting point. And I think if we can't come from a basic starting point of having a universal critical analysis on what is just and what is not, to some degree, obviously, right? Because there's always going to be some variation of that.
Sure, of course.
I don't understand how someone thinks forcefully inseminating a female animal, taking her baby from her immediately, basically after birth, hooking her up to some milking machine multiple times a day to the point that she's getting mastitis and infections and she's crying for her calf. We do this and we repeat it about 6, 7 times. Then we kill her at the end. And somebody's like, well, that's okay. I like cheese. And I mean, I liked cheese too whenever I was an animal abuser, but I don't now. It's the weight of what I know causes me to get that cheese in my hand that I can't move beyond that. Like I can't forget that portion of it. And so I think once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it's just dumbfounding to me that even when you point it out to people and you say, this is the reality, you assume that people at that point would say, okay, well, whoa, I didn't know that. I'm going to totally not do that. But then they still do it, even when they know it.
I think a lot of it is, what do they know? Because, I've always found it remarkable that women who consider themselves feminists don't see the problem with dairy products. Now, I have discussed this with zillions of women over the years, and a number of them have responded in a very concerned way, and I think a number of them have become vegans. But a lot of them haven't. Now, the problem is the way our brains are, we can shut things off that we don't want to hear. And particularly now in 2025, we have social media where you can just shop around for whatever echo chamber you want to live in. And you can find your tribe and you just stay with your tribe and you stay with those values and you just don't wander. Many years ago, I was doing a radio show in New York and I was talking about dairy products. And I said, because the host was saying, well, you're not just a vegetarian, you're a vegan. I said, that's right. And I made the comment, I said, I think dairy products are every bit as bad, as violent, as horrible as meat. And afterwards, this guy called into the show and they told him how he could contact me at the university. And he contacted me and he said, look, I want you to come and spend a couple of days. I have an organic dairy farm in New England. And he said, we don't do any of the things. I want you to come. I want you to stay at my house. I had to sign something that said I would never disclose where his farm was. But I did. I went there for several days and it was absolutely horrible.
And you're staying there. Now you can't get out.
But I wanted to see it because I wanted to see this was the high end of humane dairy farming. And the difference was primarily they didn't take the calves away immediately, which they do in commercial dairy farming. They take the calves away for hours, literally after they're born. They let the calves stay with the mothers for a while, but then they took them away and the mothers would go crazy and cry. And I was there for several days and they didn't give them antibiotics when they got mastitis because it was organic and they couldn't do that. That's actually worse for them because you give them the antibiotics, the mastitis goes away. If you don't give them the antibiotics, they have that irritation and that problem. I know a lot of really fabulous feminists, women that I can't tell you how much I respect them. And they don't see this. But they're good people. And so I have to ask myself, why the hell is this happening? How does this happen? How do we segment ourselves off this way? And the only thing I can think is that we've created a world where we're all surrounded by people who agree with us about everything. And so we don't ever have to sort of examine the beliefs that we have. And so one of the things that I think was exciting about the time I grew up in the 60s and 70s. We talked about everything. There was much more discussion. I don't mean to suggest that everything was perfect. It wasn't, but we talked about things and there were no limits on what you could talk about. Now, if I say something to a feminist that she doesn't like, the first thing I get is, well, you're mansplaining. I'm not mansplaining. I've got an argument. You think the argument's bad? Tell me why the argument's bad. Don't give me this bullshit that I'm mansplaining. But see, this goes with identity politics, the idea that it's no longer a question of whether the position is right or wrong. It's a question about who's saying it. That's bizarre. That's silly. That's stupid. But a lot of intelligent people buy into that stuff. So frankly, I remember thinking when computers came along, well, this is going to be really great because there's going to be all sorts of things we can do that we weren't able to do, like what you and I are doing right now. Computers are great in one sense, but what they've done is they've encouraged us to sort of go into these bunkers where we create these little communities and we don't let anybody else in. You've got to sort of stay with the orthodoxy. I mean, I have this problem with free speech people because I'm part of that sort of free speech community. Now, they get upset with me because I say I have an issue with pornography. I'm not in favor of government saying what can be accessed or not accessed. What I'm interested in doing is asking men, do you really think you can have a healthy relationship with a woman if you're into pornography? Just think about that for a second. Just think about it from a purely practical point of view. Andrea Dworkin, whom I actually had the pleasure to meet many years ago, she was into this idea that we should outlaw violent pornography. I don't like that stuff. I don't like any of it, but I don't know how the hell you sort of outlaw this stuff. It has to be just the case that people don't want to consume it because they see the pathology of it. They see the demand is pathological, and they see that you can't have a healthy relationship with a woman if pornography is part of your thinking about women. That doesn't mean we should outlaw it. It just means, what the hell are we consuming it for? I mean, it's counterproductive. It condemns us substantially to dysfunctional relationships with women. I was having better discussions with people about moral issues 30 years ago than I'm having now. That's the thing that I don't like at all. That 30 years ago, I was able to raise these issues in mixed groups of people and sort of get people, and they would get upset. They would, sometimes they yell at me and stuff, but we would engage the ideas. We don't do that anymore because the moment you slip out of that tribe, then it's boom. What's wrong with you?
Canceled.
Exactly. It's a serious problem. Serious problem.
I think we've seen that more pronounced with the gender issue in the universities. Like every week, I think on Twitter, I'm seeing something about somebody giving a lecture and doing just that, like trying to take people into just dialogue and very non-confrontational, very non-offensive even, just general, hey, have you thought about it from this angle? And people, like you said, they're just in these tight little boxes where they just can't step out of that even on their own accord, not even from the backlash within their own groups, which obviously plays a part. But you could even get them in a room one-on-one away from their peers in the echo chamber and challenge them on these things. And they just have such rigid conformity to their ideologies. And, I get that myself too. People saying, oh, you're so rigid in what you believe. But I think for me, the one thing is that I'm a defector of sex work ideology. So I like to think I've been to both sides and found where I believe is a healthy middle ground, still abolitionist, obviously, but it worries me that we can't have those types of conversations. And you'll just plant a little seed and kind of test out who is open to dialogue and who is not going to be reactive and defensive. And it's very few people now. And it really makes me worried about academia. Like just last week, a university here in my city of Edmonton, they were platforming a book that was written by a Brazilian, quote, sex worker, talking about the brothel being a place for all women to gather, reform, and revolt against patriarchy. And they're hosting this at a university. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And I wouldn't ever go there and try to shut it down, obviously, because I'm all about free speech too. And I believe in the argument being the art of what brings us together, not canceling, right? But it just really was like, okay, would they also platform a sex industry abolitionist piece of work or author or activist or anything like that? And usually the answer is no. I guess you're probably seeing that all across academia, which was probably quite challenging for you, trying to reach people at this level that they seemingly just can't be reached at now.
When I became an academic in the 1980s, people were allowed and encouraged to sort of argue with each other about all sorts of issues. Now we have this idea that if you expose a student to something that they don't agree with, they need a safe space and you better give them some cookies and an opportunity to spend some time with a golden retriever or something because they've been traumatized. It's not clear to me that the universities are going to recover. I think they're doing students a very great disservice of encouraging them to believe that the world is a place where everybody's going to agree with their views. I have very strong views, but my position is prove me wrong. I'll talk to anybody. If you think I'm wrong, fine. Tell me why I'm wrong. Let's talk about it. And I'm sure you're the same way. I'm sure you're not going to say to somebody who says, I think sex work is great, that you're going to sort of like throw hot coffee in their face and walk away. You're going to say, okay, why do you think it's great? What value do you think it's serving? And universities have become very confined spaces. I loved being a professor until about the past 5 or 6 years. It got really bad. I used to teach a course in human rights and animal rights. And I think it was called Human and Non-Human Rights. And when I talked about, quote, sex work, and I talked about how insidious that was, I would get people who would say, well, but that's agency. It's women's agency. And I'd say, okay, what do you mean by that? I'm not saying if a woman chooses to do that sort of thing, that's her choice. I'm not going to tell her she can't do that. I'm not going to have laws that should prohibit her making those choices. But I think it's sad that she makes those choices. And I think that it's sad that I live in a world where those are the choices which are presented to women. But what I was finding is people were not interested in discussing that. It was like, I said that sex work was bad. That meant I was being sexist because I didn't see the value of women's agency. And if I would say something like, well, I think the problem is women, many of the opportunities they're given are opportunities to commodify themselves and to be providers of sexual services, whether as prostitutes or as wives, frankly. But no, you can't even have those discussions anymore. And many, quote, intellectuals, and I use that word guardedly, many intellectuals have gotten into this whole postmodern business that there's no such thing as truth. It's all a matter of lived experience. And that's nonsense. That's complete nonsense. I think it's great to sort of challenge universal truths or at least test them. But there are some things that are true and there are some things that are false. And sort of to say this idea that whether I'm a man or a woman is a matter of my lived experience. No, it's not. It's a matter of biology. You could be a male who adopts stereotypically feminine ways of relating to the world, gender. You can be a woman who gets into more male or more masculine gender expressions, but you can't change your sex. It's in every cell of your body. You just can't do it. And this idea that, truth is a matter of our lived experience. Well, then everybody's got a different lived experience. So that means there's no such thing as truth. You can't have a functioning world in which there's no such thing as truth. And there clearly is truth. Airplanes still go up, and there's still a thing called gravity. If I take a cup and pour the water out, it goes down. There are still some things that are true and false.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think so much of it is that people internalize myths. There's this lack of objective truth. There's this lack of a critical analysis. And so what are some of the most powerful myths that you see that you believe allow exploitation to persist? For example, animals are here for us. Sex work is empowering. It's women's bodily autonomy. Is there any kind of universal myths that function to relieve people of moral responsibility?
The prevailing male myth is the myth of male superiority. I mean, once you have holy books that talk about God as a male, you're in big trouble. I mean, once you say God's a he, that's serious stuff. And if you just look at, like, for example, the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have God, a male, creates the world and gives it to Adam and Eve. A conspiracy happens between a woman and a snake, and poor Adam gets screwed because, she tells him to eat the goddamn apple, and, he does. And then all of a sudden they're in big trouble. And so you have foundational books in which women are sort of seen as manipulating men. And everybody always says that Genesis says God gave man dominion over the animals. That's actually not true. When God creates the world in Genesis, God creates the animals, he creates the humans. Nobody is eating anybody else. Nobody is killing. He says to the animals, the herb and the seed shall be your food. He says to the humans, the herb and the seed shall be your food. Everybody's vegan in the beginning of Genesis. In Genesis 29, and I'm not a religious person, I'm just, I read. Violence only starts happening when there's this rift between God and humans because Adam wanders and takes the apple that Eve tells him to eat. They get in trouble. They get thrown out of the Garden of Eden. The covenant is breached between humans and God, and then killing begins. In the beginning, everybody's a vegan. And later on in the Old Testament, you have the prophets talking about when there's a reuniting of the covenant, the lion shall lay down with the lamb, none shall be killed in all of my holy kingdom. I mean, there's this idea about nonviolence and about how the optimal situation when one is in communion with God, when the covenant is restored, is one is nonviolent. Now, having said that, the Old Testament is full of all sorts of stuff where, rape is approved, slavery is approved, all sorts of other bad stuff is approved.
Homosexuality is denounced.
Yes, exactly. And the bottom line is, once you start off with any myth or any story or fantasy or whatever, that God is a man, there's no way to get equality anymore between men and women. That's the problem, because we are still the paradigm, God help us, of perfection or whatever. And you're the problem. You're the one who got us thrown out of the garden. But this is true whether it's Judeo-Christian or whether it's Islam or what. I mean, it doesn't matter what the tradition is. All of these traditions are terribly sexist, all of them. They all talk about the preferred position of men. And once you adopt that sort of ideology, how do you have equality? When I came out of law school in the early 1980s, there were very few women who were partners in big law firms. There are more women who are partners in big law firms. So what? There are some changes in that respect. But to say that we are anywhere near equality, if somebody said that to me, I would seriously wonder what they were taking, because how could anyone think that?
Yeah, what world they're living in.
I mean, I don't mean to be a downer because you are a woman, and I don't mean to, but you're not equal. You're not equal.
No, we're not.
And that's always going to be a problem. And, I had this fight with the animal movement, and the animal movement is horribly sexist. Now, you would think, here are people who are concerned about animals. Are they concerned about women? Answer, no. I remember in 1985, I will never forget this. I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. I was teaching for the first time a course in jurisprudence, philosophy of law. And I had a section in the course about animals. And I believe it was the first time that animal rights was discussed in an American law school. I'm not aware of anybody else who did it before I did. And I remember this was 85. And I remember we were living in Philadelphia, which is where Penn is. I went into this local grocery store and I went past the chickens. And there were all these chickens in these little styrofoam packs. And it just hit me. I mean, it was like sort of like a weight came down on my head that I thought, these animals don't exist anymore. They're just body parts in a piece of plastic. And it occurred to me that that's what pornography was. The woman is not there. What's there is the body part. Whatever body part you fetishize is there. And nothing else is there. I remember thinking this was like 5 years before Carol Adams wrote Sexual Politics. This is way back. Carol didn't write that book until like 1990. And she wasn't promoting veganism, by the way. I understand she's become a vegan, but she wasn't back then. And so I remember having this idea in this grocery store and going home and telling Anna, and we were talking, we stayed up most of the night talking about this. And I thought that, you consume chicken, you consume pornography, it's all the same. This is all the, and the next day I went into class and I, enthusiastically communicated this information to my students, half of whom thought it was like visionary and the other half thought I was nuts. And it just occurred to me then that this is all the same, that what we're doing is consuming body parts, whether we consume them as chicken or whether we consume them as, body parts in pornography or movies or whatever crap that we're looking at. It's all the same. I was involved with PETA very early on. I mean, I got involved with PETA when there were like 10 people. I mean, there were very few of us. It was a very small organization and we were all vegans at that time. And then as PETA got bigger and money started coming in, they started coming up with campaigns that were really problematic for me. And one of them, I will never forget when we had the meeting in 1989 when the I'd rather go naked than wear fur stuff was announced. We were sitting in this room in Bethesda, Maryland, I believe. And there was a guy that they had hired. He thought this was a wonderful way of, as he said it, putting the T and A back in PETA.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know. That's what he said.
I shouldn't even laugh. That's so wrong.
And I was sitting there and I was listening to this. And I don't know, there were maybe 15 people in the room and everybody was sort of reacting. And so it got to me and I said, this is the most fucked up thing I've ever. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to say that on your podcast.
No. Hey, you could say, good for you. Good for you saying that.
I said, this is the most fucked up thing I've ever heard. I said, you're trying to tell me that we're going to get people to stop commodifying animals by reinforcing the commodification of women. And I said, I just don't get it. And I had arguments because, there were lots of little PETA people because by 89, they'd become a large organization, big offices, lots of people. And I remember having a conversation with some woman who said, I'm willing to take off my clothes for the animals. And I remember saying to her, are you like for real? Do you really think you're going to get people to become vegans because you walk up to them with lettuce leaves pasted on your breasts and handing them a veggie dog? Do you really think that's gonna change things? And I remember being told at that time by one of the leaders of PETA that I was being an ivory tower academic. And I said, no. I'm the most relentlessly practical person you're ever going to meet. And I'm telling you right now, all you're going to do is reinforce exploitation. And then they got into all the stuff about, all the S&M stuff where they were producing, they were actually selling for a while. They were selling the Plether whips and stuff like that. I mean,
Yes.
and it's like, what are you doing?
Were they advertising in Playboy too? Didn't they run?
Oh, yeah. I remember I was out in Los Angeles at an event with some of the PETA people, and I was told that we had been invited to the Playboy Mansion. And was I going to go? And I said, no, I'm not going there. And they said, but why? Because Playboy was supportive of them and whatnot. And I had no desire to meet Hugh Hefner. I mean, it would have been interesting to have a discussion with him, but guys like that are simply not, they're not open to those sorts of discussions. And he couldn't be open to that in certain ways because he was running a magazine that basically promoted the idea that women were sexual objects, that they were being liberated by accepting that they were sexual objects. So it was like screwed up on multiple levels. I just thought it was really bad for us to be promoting that sort of stuff. But, it was reflected in the movement. You'd go to these conferences, most of the leaders of the movement were men. Most of the people who came to the conferences were women. And so you could go to these conferences and you could have a wonderful time, in a weekend. And I thought it was horrifying. A number of these people have had to resign their high-level, high-paid jobs because they were engaged in sexual harassment, a number of them. There was a lot of other stuff that was going on. And it got to the point where I became so disgusted with the sexism of it that I thought going to animal rights conferences is not an opportunity to educate people. It's an opportunity for male leaders to have endless, you could have fun all weekend long. I had a public dispute with several of them. I mean, look, I had a problem with Feminists for Animal Rights. In 1990, when they started the I'd Rather Go Naked Than Wear Fur, I went to Feminists for Animal Rights and Carol Adams and those people, and I said, we've got to do something about this. They wouldn't do anything because Ingrid Newkirk of PETA was a woman. And I said, what difference does that make? And so I was out there from 90 to 95, basically. I was out there by myself. And I mean, I'd go to conference, I would talk about this. I got spit on by women who said that by calling these campaigns sexist, I was betraying the animals. I said, no, I'm not. I mean, I had some really bad experiences. And then in 95, Feminists for Animal Rights came out against this. But by 95, it was sort of so thoroughly entrenched. And they were so into the porn of it, and I just thought, this is not what I'm about. This is not what I see. I see this as a problem, not as something which is helping animals. But I quickly learned that in the societies we live in, these charities, for the most part, they sell stuff. They're businesses. And if you take a principal position, you won't get as many donors. The I'd Rather Go Naked Than Wear Fur stuff was intended to sort of bring in money from people who were already convinced, and all the young kids who thought this was cool. And so now you have this intersectional veganism, which, like intersectional feminism, has very little to do with veganism, where, people say, well, we ought to be vegans, but if you're a member of an ethnic group that exploits animals, well, we're not going to tell you shouldn't do that because that would be colonialist or this or that, and it's just like, oh, please, will you stop with this? I'm not optimistic it's going to get better. I mean, I'm a vegan. You couldn't pay me to eat an animal product. In the same way, you couldn't pay me to go and take the organs out of some mentally compromised person. So, there are certain things you don't do. There's a fundamental philosophical problem. It manifests in general society and in the animal movement, and that is the tension between consequentialism and rights theory. The consequential position is what is right or wrong is that which maximizes the good consequences. So you get people saying, well, we ought to make animal exploitation more humane because people aren't going to become vegan. So it's better to sort of encourage them to eat more humanely produced animals. And that will be, that it replicates itself when you talk about all sorts of moral issues, including sex work. And people say, well, let's unionize it. Let's do something wrong in the right way. And the answer is you can't do that. Look, we have to think in some consequential ways. If I'm a legislator and I've got $10,000 to allocate, I should allocate it to where it's going to do the best work. But if the question is a different question, which beings should I treat in an instrumental way? The answer is you shouldn't treat any of them in an instrumental way. That's not a matter of consequential thinking. That's a matter of fundamental justice. And so we ought not to be saying, well, prostitution is bad, but the solution is let's have a more humane prostitution. Let's have the equivalent of cage-free eggs and crate-free pork, and let's have unionized prostitution. I mean, and it's a disaster. And I had that from my students. People would say, well, what's wrong with unionized prostitution? And I actually had an Australian friend who came and stayed with us some years ago, who ran a prostitution operation in Australia. And I remember having these knockdown, drag-out arguments with her about, unionization sort of removed the problems. No, it doesn't remove the problems. It just casts them in a different way that makes the whole hideous enterprise more acceptable.
Yes, sanctions them effectively.
Exactly. Puts a big stamp of approval on.
Government approved. Harm reduction. Not really.
Who could argue? It's a union.
Yeah. If you're a leftist, you support unions.
Exactly. And the other thing that's been so strange is I've always been a lefty all my life. And I don't know where I fit anymore because, I can't vote for Democrats anymore. They're all in favor of this insanity, and they're all in favor of these things that I think are fundamentally wrong. And I'm not a conservative. I mean, it's just like, I don't know where to go anymore.
You're politically homeless with me. We're in some odd little middle ground space.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm the same classic leftist, but, the left is now neoliberal, and I can't get behind that, of the marketization of humans through surrogacy, through prostitution, through gender ideology, and, the caricature creation of woman. Before we go into harm reduction versus abolition, because that's something I definitely want to pick your brain on, I want to jump back to the I'd rather go naked than wear fur campaign. Because it's so interesting that you said this, because I know both you and I, since we've been friends on Twitter, we've both seen multiple ads coming up that are sexist from groups like PETA and others. And so there was one that was on November 12th, which I tagged you in, and we both had a little grimace moment about it. And it was Alicia Silverstone doing a I'd rather go naked than wear wool campaign. And so for anyone listening who didn't have the misfortune of seeing this ad, it was Alicia Silverstone just totally naked from the backside, and she's holding a mask of a lamb. And I thought to myself, like, what is this actually doing? And you put it so eloquently in your comment. You said, this does nothing for the animals. And I thought, yeah, it really doesn't. And so I showed it to my husband, actually. And I said, like, look, this is kind of where we're at, like with veganism, with the objectification of women. And he said, well, they're really trying to market it to men, right? Because more women are vegan and they might, hear the message. But really, this is an ad to try to reach men, because there's this tie of masculinity to meat eating through, the barbecue kind of culture, the hunting culture, and all those things. And I thought, wow, he's got a point there. And so I, of course, scrolled through the comments, which I never recommend anyone doing for any social media post of any kind of political topic. But okay, so some of the comments, I didn't quote them exactly, but a summary. One man calls her filthy. Another one calls her a dirty hoe. Another man calls her a dumb whore. One man laughs and attacks her physique, telling her, put some clothes on. One man says that she's too old to pose naked anymore. There was several men who referenced how they would be masturbating to that photo of her later. Another man says that he would, quote, chuck one up her. And at the time, just that day, whenever I looked at it, because I didn't go back to it again, it was bookmarked over 100 times, presumably for men to masturbate to later. So, whenever you said, like, this does nothing for the animals, I thought, not only that, but it also harms the woman. There's nothing nice being said about her. Like, great job, Alicia, raising awareness about, the harms of wool, and hats off to you. It was just an onslaught of misogynistic, hate-filled comments that she got. And I really thought, really, what was accomplished by this? I didn't see any positive outcome that I could conclude from the comments, or just my own sentiments of seeing it, of how it would actually incite change, meaningful change.
Well, Andrea, that was my argument in 1989 when this first was announced. And I thought, does anybody think this is going to do anything positive? All it's going to do is reinforce sexism and commodification of women. You're never going to stop the commodification of non-humans as long as you're commodifying women. I believe that. I'll go to my grave believing that. You're never going to jump over the woman problem and get to the I mean, it's just not going to work. PETA's philosophy has always been there's no such thing as bad publicity. So they figure that whatever gets them any notice, however in bad taste it is, however immoral it is, it doesn't matter. I mean, I remember some years ago when the former mayor of New York, who's had a meteoric disaster career, Rudy Giuliani, he had prostate cancer, and PETA came out with an ad with him with a milk mustache. And it was, got milk, Rudy, or something like that, because cow's milk increases the estrogenicity in your system. So it leads to breast cancer for women, it leads to prostate cancer for men. And I thought, what a horrible thing to sort of focus on this guy's, prostate cancer. And it's not that I'm a Giuliani fan, but they love publicity. So they'll do anything which will produce publicity for them. I saw those comments. They didn't surprise me. As a matter of fact, I would have been surprised if they were anything other than what they were. A mixture of fetishistic behavior combined with violence. But that's the whole problem of commodifying women. That's the problem. And I can't imagine what it's like to be a young person now, because the stuff that they're exposed to is so much more perverted. And when I was growing up, it was Playboy, magazine, and
pretty tame in comparison.
Well, I mean, yeah, which wasn't great, obviously, but it was Playboy. Now they're seeing all this really bad stuff, and they're thinking this is how men and women relate. And the whole thing about fetish of domination.
So I say this with total regret and humility that, it took me 9 years after I was a prostitution abolitionist before I became vegan. And I look back now and I think, how did that happen? How did I not see that universal nature of exploitation when I grasped it so strongly on one end and then didn't on the veganism topic, even though I had seen some slaughterhouse footage, I had heard of what veganism was. So it wasn't like I was totally clueless, but still I couldn't make that connection. But I wonder if you think that if someone goes vegan to avoid exploiting animals, or if they go prostitution abolition route, do you think that they are more likely to extend that ethic to opposing the opposite? Do you think that there is something in us that if we can see it in one area, we are more likely to see it in another? What is it that actually brings people to see that universal nature of exploitation?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think that people are very good at compartmentalizing things. For example, a lot of feminists don't take veganism seriously because they look at PETA and they say, well, look at that sexism and look at that, misogyny and blah, 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 blah. And you say, yeah, that's right. I agree with you. It is sexism. It is misogyny. And I don't support them either. But you're missing the point. There are aspects of the argument you're just missing. Most people, unfortunately, don't take morality seriously. And they might take morality in some areas seriously, but they don't then see the connections. And to the extent that there are things which justify their not taking the other issues seriously, they'll glom onto those things. So if I really like eating pizza with pepperoni and whatever the hell I like, and I'm an anti-prostitution advocate, and you come along, you start talking to me about veganism, I'm thinking, man, it's going to mean I can't eat my pepperoni pizzas anymore. And I see the PETA stuff and I say, that's really sexist. So I'm just going to disregard the whole issue because some people who are into this issue are sexist. I get that all the time. I mean, I get that from feminists all the time. They will say to me, how can you be a vegan when PETA does what it does? And I say, I got nothing to do with them. I walked away from that 35 years ago. And it's unfortunate that there are so many factors that influence how people react to these moral issues. So, they'll look at the veganism issue and they'll be offended by the PETA business, or they'll look at the veganism issue and they'll say, I'm promoting this and I'm an assertive male. So therefore it's mansplaining. So therefore I'm not, et cetera. So we've got all these little devices to sort of keep us eating our pizzas that sort of give us permission, go forth and eat your pizzas. I've been a vegan for 43 years. I've been a vegetarian for probably close to like 47 years. I didn't know what a vegan was. I never heard of veganism. Veganism was a British concept. Going way back then, it was not something a lot of people knew about. And so I became a vegetarian after going into a slaughterhouse. And I thought, I'm never going to eat this stuff again. I didn't. I haven't eaten meat for 47 years. And I didn't sort of gradually phase it out. It was boom, overnight. That was it. Haven't had meat for 47 years.
That was me too. Just cut it off right there. Yeah.
It was like, that's it. That's it. I don't want any of it. But when I became a vegetarian, I ramped up. I loved ice cream and cheese pizza, eggs. I used to eat fried eggs all the time. I ate animal products, but not meat anymore. And I became vegan when I met the people who started PETA, which was, as I said, there were like 8 of us. It was a very small group. And I met them and they introduced me to veganism. And my partner and I became vegans overnight. I mean, that was it. It was a Friday night in October. We had this discussion about veganism. It was the first time I heard the word. That was it. That Friday night in October of 82, that was it. I haven't had an animal product since then. Well, I didn't phase it out. Now, were there times that I sort of missed cheese pizza? And the answer is yeah, sure, because I used to eat that all the time. And when I was living in Manhattan,
there's pretty good pizza in New York.
You can't get cheese pizza any better than Ray's Pizza in the Village. And I used to live on that stuff. And people would say to me, do you miss eating cheese pizza? And I said, there's nothing I want to put in my mouth that badly that I would support that. There's nothing I could enjoy anymore. I think that, we live in a world where we don't have high moral expectations of people. So if they take a moral position on anything, they think they're wonderful and we're supposed to think they're wonderful. And we're not supposed to challenge them about anything else. So if you're taking a good position on prostitution and you think it's nonsense, which it is, then I'm supposed to say, well, God bless Andrea. She's taking a moral position. I don't want to sort of alienate her by sort of raising the veganism question. And that's a position I'm in with a lot of feminists. I really respect what they're doing and I agree with what they're doing, the second wave people. But it's very clear, once I start talking about veganism, some of those people will get really upset with me. And I find that sad because what they're doing in certain ways is emulating very male ways of looking at the world. Like, if you disagree with something, you try to shut it down. You say whatever you have to say to shut it up. On the other hand, there are a lot of those people who are vegans, but they don't talk about it because, they'll get yelled at. It's like we're living in a world where to take a moral position and to sort of reject violence is likely to result in a violent reaction against you because you're taking a nonviolent position. That said, I'm completely sympathetic with the people who say that the organized animal movement is a sexist cesspool because it is. Some of the stories about what's happened with these people in these corporations that are making hundreds and thousands of dollars and then they end up engaging in sexual stuff that gets them fired and stuff. And you think, these people are doing animal work. Don't they see the connection? The answer is obviously not.
Yeah, it totally goes both ways. And I think it goes back to you can be effective in your messaging without actually being effective. You can be effective in reach and in shock value, but that doesn't mean that you're actually effective in igniting change. And I think that that's such a big problem that I've seen in just the 4 years that I've been vegan. And like you, I went vegan very quickly. Well, actually, it's kind of interesting. I always say I kind of became vegan for selfish reasons first and foremost. I became plant-based before I became vegan. I think at that time I was 38 and I was having just stomach pains. I didn't know at the time I was lactose intolerant, which most people are. I found out later 75-80% of people are, which makes sense because it's not your species of milk that you're drinking. I went to see a doctor because I thought, maybe I'm perimenopausal and I'm just getting all these weird hormone fluctuations. And that's when I did a food test and a hormone test. And he said to me, you're severely lactose intolerant. And you also are allergic to eggs. And like you, I had eaten eggs quite consistently. And so he said to me, do you eat a lot of meat? And I said, well, not really. I don't know if it's because it's my blood type or what, but it's just never really sat well in my stomach. I've been on and off vegetarian since I was probably about 11 or 12. And I'd eat meat, in kind of short bursts and then get really turned off of it. And he said, well, then you're a prime candidate to go vegan. And that was kind of, I thought to myself, those are like those hipster kind of people with the dreadlocks that live out in California, and I don't know, is that really going to work up here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada? This is a cattle region of the north, So I wasn't too sure, but I went home and thought, well, I really should eat for my body and what he's telling me. And then that's when I started Googling vegan recipes. And that's where I found this more moral argument about veganism and very quickly found your work. And then, of course, I followed you on Twitter. I don't think you noticed me for probably the first year or so that I followed you, but I was watching all your videos and binging on them. I'd go run on the trail and put on one of your university lectures on YouTube and just totally zone out. And I'm like, everything he is saying just makes so much sense. And with every line that you would say, I could just draw these parallels with prostitution and sexual exploitation. I'm like, literally he could change the title of this presentation to be about prostitution and just say women instead of animals. And it's almost this universal argument. So then for me, there was no going back. Like at no point did I ever think I will one day maybe eat meat or, eat something else animal based. Like never again. I like you, I would rather go 2 days of just drinking water and just do a fast than ever put another animal product in my mouth, because I really want to live a life that is morally consistent and one that's rooted in nonviolence. And I think if we can all get to that point, we would see a better world for all of us. So, I've challenged other feminists that are staunch abolitionists about prostitution. And I say to them, like, why can't you have the same sympathy for the females of another species than just, human? I don't know. They never come up with a good answer, obviously, in my books, but I fail to understand how people can see an animal and not see that there's somebody in there, in that body, that form. There's someone in there. And that's what I always keep saying to them. Like, yes, they're not human. So maybe you're not seeing them as valuable or equal or whatever, but there's still someone in there, someone who has a family, someone who feels fear, someone who feels joy. Like you see that with cows running through the fields in the sanctuaries, kicking the balls. Like they play, they cuddle when they sleep. How do you think then that they can't suffer when you inflict some kind of harm on them or factory farm them? And I've almost had to stop talking about it, which really bothers me because I want to be talking about it. I do vegan activism in Edmonton here, and we go and hold vigils outside of slaughterhouses and put up signs for the transport drivers. Many of them are exploited as well, too, newcomers to our country that can't find employment elsewhere, slaughterhouse workers. But I almost feel like in academic circles and in feminist circles, I get too angry whenever I try to push the issue. So I've just sort of gone into my echo chamber with the fellow vegans and tried to reach people in the real world, because it's amazing. I'll hold a sign outside of a slaughterhouse and it says apathy and puts a little X, and then empathy and it has a check mark. So I hold that up as people drive past to say, like, we got to think about this on a deeper level. And surprisingly, people honk and give thumbs up and they're all for it. But then I think to myself, how many of you are going home and eating a chicken tonight for your dinner? You kind of have to pick your battles, because the topic of exploitation, you just burn out so quickly. And sometimes I just think maybe I'll come back to this person in a year or two, and maybe with some other exposure or something that puts them over the edge, like, that doctor did for me 9 years later. And then I just stumbled into it. They just haven't had their moment yet. And I'm not going to maybe be the one at this time to take them there. So you just kind of have to almost go into self-preservation.
A lot of people, I think, are very sensitive to criticism. When I first came out about this stuff, when I came out about the I'd rather go naked than wear furs, I got huge amounts of hostility from animal people. And when I started taking the position that welfare reform was nonsense and that it was simply trying to encourage people to continue to exploit animals, but we would give them a pass if they contributed to these animal groups because they were promoting humane exploitation, which is nonsense, the reaction was horribly hostile. People are very sensitive. In so many ways, we're such a pathetic species in terms of our unwillingness to make even small changes because we're worried about criticism from other people. I'm going to repeat what I said before. I don't think, when you say, well, is there hope for the future? I'm not sure whether there is, but I got to get up every day and I have to live my life. And you got to get up every day and live your life. How the hell do you live? The existential challenge. What do you do? What do you say? How do you interact with other people? I have conversations about this with people every day of my life. I go to the store. I've got 12 heads of kale in my cart. So somebody asked me if I run a restaurant, and I say, no, this is just what I consume. I have one of these things in a smoothie almost every day. And then they'll say, well, where do you get your protein from? I mean, do you know how many times I've been asked, where do you get your protein from? Thousands of times. And I just keep on having pleasant conversations with people. I keep pretending that every time I'm asked the question I've been asked 43 million times, I pretend that I heard it for the first time and I act engaged. You have to, because if you don't, you turn people off. And so if the goal is to educate them, you got to educate them. And the one thing I have learned as an educator is you never educate people if you make them feel dumb. I think if most people saw what happens to cows, I think they would be horrified. People can turn it off when it's just an abstract issue.
When there's the happy cow on their cheese product, right?
Exactly. You're following a truck on the highway that's got chicken parts in it, and it's like a happy chicken. And
it's like the happy hooker, right?
A happy hooker. Exactly. So what we're doing is we're trying to explain that, these animals actually love being exploited by us. These women love being exploited by us. These are myths we tell ourselves, but you know what? They're powerful myths because they allow us to do what we want to do. And most of these charitable organizations are complete disasters because they're encouraging people to believe that there's a right way to do the wrong thing. So they're just telling people, well, it's fine. You don't have to be vegan. Just like buy humanely raised this and give us a donation. It's almost like the Catholic Church saying, well, if you want to continue to have affairs, you want to continue to engage in sin, give us some money and we'll give you an indulgence and you can continue sinning.
Or just come repent every Sunday and then carry on.
Come to confession, the priest will give you absolution. You can go out and do it again. But we're getting to a point now where I think I've seen it for the past few years as sort of a crisis point of our inability and unwillingness to take morality seriously. We're living in a very dangerous world right now. And you have a lot of people, a lot of men who want glory and think that you get glory through conquest and violence and things like that. And that's dangerous when you live in a world where we can annihilate each other 16 times over. I mean, there's enough nuclear power in the world to destroy the world many times over.
Yeah, I read this amazing paper not too long ago. It was an older paper, and I want to say it was Melissa Farley who partnered with somebody who wrote it, prostitution activist and researcher. And it was an article talking about men's desire to consume and dominate, like what you just said. And it was talking about land. And so I know, there's obviously the climate angle to this too, but it was talking about dominating land, and especially here in Canada with like the harsh weather. And can you dominate it? Can you get to the point where you own the land and you control it to some degree so that you can be above it? It doesn't control you. And it was saying the same thing about women in prostitution. And I think that's the same with the animals too, right? There's always somebody, I think, a little bit lower or who you perceive to be lower that you punch down on. And you see that with men who get punched down on by their bosses. Well, they go home and they punch down on the wives. Women who get punched down by the husbands, sometimes, unfortunately, they punch down on sons or daughters. You look to the person that you can control and go after. And I think that's probably a big part of the animal exploitation, is that so many people don't feel they can compete with people on an even playing field. So they have to find something or someone to dominate, whether that's land or an animal.
Exactly. I mean, there's something fundamentally morally problematic about us as a species. We're very easily corrupted, as it were. I've always been amazed at, when you try to talk about prostitution or other forms of exotic dancing places or strip joints or whatever they're called, you try to say, you feel okay about that? Yeah. Okay. Would you be happy if that was a relative of yours? Well, no. Well, that's somebody's relative that you're getting off watching. You have to sort of take a step back and say, are these people this dumb that they haven't figured this out? But I don't think it's a question of stupidity. I think it's a question of moral limitation, that they just don't think that way.
Do you think it's maybe also courage as well, and lack of vulnerability, particularly in men, with the hyper-masculine connotation of meat and pornography consumption among men?
Oh, sure. There is no doubt about it that we live in a culture where exploitation is considered to be a desirable manly attribute. I mean, years ago, not that many years ago, we used to have actors on television talking about how, men eat meat. And we still reinforce this idea of the desirable man is the man who can get women. It manifested itself when I was a kid. You had these James Bond movies where James Bond was this character he engaged in violence and killed people without a second thought. He used women, and he was sort of held up as some sort of paradigm. And I remember going to see those movies and thinking, wow, James Bond, And a couple of years ago, I watched all the James Bond movies again, and I was shocked at how relentlessly horrible they were in terms of how they portrayed women. And I was thinking, man, it's amazing. I saw this stuff when I was 10 or 12 or 15 years old, and it didn't sort of cause me to become a complete, moral eunuch or something. That sort of imagery, I mean, yes, it's changed to some degree. So we no longer think that it's only women in their 20s who are sexually appealing. So we've now extended it a little bit. So Sharon Stone can say, wow, I got a naked scene when I was 40, and this is really progress. Things have changed in certain ways, but they haven't changed in certain ways. It's still the same thing. I mean, I've had this discussion about pornography with guys. One way, I tell you, if you really, really, really want to piss everybody off at a party, try to get people talking about whether or not men should consume pornography. And you can turn a very affable, fun sort of situation into a situation in which you're at risk of being killed. And all you're saying is, look, I'm not in favor of censorship because I'm not. I don't think governments ever do that right. And they almost always do it wrong. But if you say, guys, we got to think about whether this is a good idea to consume, because the institution itself is inherently problematic. It's inherently violent. And I'm using that literally. I see pornography as a form of violence. Even the stuff that's not S&M stuff, it's all violent because it's all commodification. And you say that in front of a group of guys, you just better hope that nobody's got a weapon.
You better be close to the door.
Exactly, because people get very upset about that. And if you say something like, I'm sorry, but you cannot have a healthy relationship with a woman if that is part of the background noise of your thinking. You just can't have a healthy relationship because she's always seen as nothing more than a provider of sexual services. She's a tool. But what I do not understand and never will understand is a lot of these people, they all had mothers and many of them have daughters. And you think, does it not occur to you? Does it not occur to you that they're part of this and they're going to be victimized by it? You want to get people pissed off? You say to them, are you not worried that your daughter is going to be victimized by this bullshit? And I'm telling you, you can have people you've known for many years that you think you've had close relationships with. You say something like that, and boy, you can get people really riled up. But it seems to me it doesn't even seem to be open to disagreement. In this society, if you have a daughter, she's going to be exploited. She's going to be commodified.
And sometimes it's like they can't understand that even if she's not directly exploited in prostitution, she's going to be impacted by that pro-sex work culture. And we see that at the John School too, which is an alternative measures program that we put men through after they've been arrested for trying to pay to sexually exploit someone. And we always ask them in the class, who has a daughter? Who has a mother? Of course, everyone raises their hand and we think, can you not see that connection that you were going to harm someone else? Because we also ask them, of course, wouldn't you just want to kill somebody? Not literally, but really want to wring their neck if they'd sexually exploited your daughter, if a group of 6 men lined up and used their money to have their way with her because she was vulnerable. And they all raise their hands. Oh yeah, totally, I'd kick his ass, and I'm like, where is this cognitive dissonance? How do we bridge this again? And you'll say this, well, that's somebody's daughter, that's somebody's wife or mom, or, and I even hate saying that because then it still makes it the relation to somebody, right? She's somebody's significant person, but rather than just looking at she is someone, which goes back to what you said about just having moral value as a person, having inherent dignity afforded to you, just for being who you are. And sometimes I'm with you, Professor, where I just think, what's it all for? There's been so many days where I lay in bed at night and I ponder my life and I'm like, what am I doing this for? It's been 13 years now. And, really what progress have I seen? And I mean, I have seen some progress, but then I think, has it really changed the bigger picture of it? And I echo your sentiments. I really don't know if law is the right approach. But then I think, okay, you look at the normative effect that law does have, right? If we have full decriminalization where it's an anything goes, then we have no form of kind of constraint on people. I don't want to have legal constraint on people, but it kind of seems that sometimes that's the only thing that holds them back because they lack the moral constraint that you would hope that they would have just by seeing the inherent injustice of these things.
I agree, but you have to remember, you don't change people's thinking with the law. The law doesn't result in moral change, but basically people change their behavior. They're just frightened of being punished. In the whole time I've been on the planet, law doesn't really change things. Law follows change. The one thing I saw in my lifetime where the law sort of got out ahead was about abortion. Because, when I was a kid, if a woman wanted an abortion, she'd go to, there were people who did abortions and they would provide abortions and whatnot. They were legal. And then 1973 comes along and Roe versus Wade comes along. And from the moment that decision came down, it's been whittled away and whittled away and whittled away because it changed the moral structure of things. And society wasn't ready for that yet. And so I do think pursuing things like the Nordic model and whatnot is a good idea. Don't criminalize the woman, criminalize the buyer. And I think it's ingenious, actually. I really do. I agree with you. When you say, well, somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, the point is not simply that only daughters and mothers are valuable. Everybody's valuable. But I think it's important because men just don't see, you think, do you not see the connection here? I mean, and do you not see that what you're doing is perpetuating a structure which is going to continue to harm people you love. But I also think if you get up in the morning and you say, what have I done? And, is this going to work? The answer is, you might as well stop, because that's not the right question. The right question is, I'm on this planet for a short period of time. What is my responsibility? How ought I to live? It's an existential question. Once you think of it as winning or losing, Andrea, I hate to be a downer, but you and I are both going to, you a lot longer after me, but we're both going to leave the planet. And it's probably not going to be a hell of a lot different, or maybe worse. But that's not the point. The point is, what did you do on a daily basis to try to make it a better place? And, I think we fall into this sort of Western American-y sort of thing about who's going to win and who's going to lose. And the answer is, that's not the right question. The question is, how do you live your life? And I've gotten a lot of people to go vegan. Have I created a vegan world? Absolutely not. Am I going to create a vegan world? No, I'm going to leave this planet and it ain't going to be a vegan world. But I did what I thought was right on a daily basis I got up in the morning and said, well, if I'm not going to shoot myself, what am I going to do today? I'm actually working on an essay now in which I'm trying to I want to talk to you about veganism. I want to tell you what to do. I don't want to lecture to you. I just want you to think about these things and to engage your brain about these things, to try to get it away from this idea that, because vegans can be terribly obnoxious. I've known people who would go into restaurants and call people murderers and things like that.
I called them animal abusers earlier in this.
Well, no, but I mean, if you go into a restaurant when people are eating animals and you start calling them names, let me tell you something, you ain't going to get very far. But there are all these groups that do nothing but, they dress up in their uniform T-shirts. They all wear the same T-shirt, and they go into these restaurants and they yell at people, or they go to slaughterhouses and yell and scream at people. That doesn't work. So we do have a reputation as being obnoxious people. And I would like to try to dispel that by just saying, can we engage these issues? But I do think that if you look at it as whether you're going to win or lose, you're not going to come up with the right answer, and you're going to feel unmotivated. Be real honest with you. I know I'm going to leave the planet not vegan. I will, quote, lose. And you know what? I'm still going to get up every damn day of my life, and I'm going to fight like hell to try to get 1 or 2 or 3 people to go vegan. I'm just going to do that. And I'm not going to think about whether or not I'm going to win or whether I'm going to lose. It's not a football game. This is something different. It's the existential challenge that I have. How do I live my life? What sort of person am I? What do I believe in? I can also tell you that over the years, I've known a lot of zillions of animal people, and a lot of them actually were prostitutes, because I believe they feel commodification. We intellectualize it, they feel it. I remember having an incredible discussion with somebody in 1985 who was a prostitute. And I remember that discussion because she was saying, in essence, that she didn't say it quite that way, but she was saying, I know what it's like to be an animal. Prostitutes feel the commodification. I can think about it, but I'm not commodified. I'm a white male. I'm a white middle-class male. The world was made for me. The world was made for me. And I can understand it intellectually. I can't feel it. It's their lived experience. It's not my lived experience.
It's interesting that you say that, because as soon as you said that, I never thought of that. But thinking back in my mind now of several women I've known in the industry, they were vegetarian. Well, maybe I met one who was fully vegan, but numerous that were vegetarian. And I didn't have the wherewithal at the time to ask, is this tied to the commodification of us? Because I didn't even recognize I was being commodified until the later parts of my time in the industry. But it's interesting that you draw that parallel, that even if they don't recognize it like that woman did, and she spoke it to you verbally, but I think a lot of times they just feel it and it's enough to change their behavior, but they haven't intellectualized it or contextualized it just yet.
And when you think about it, the connections are so obvious. Somebody pays you and has sex with you. Somebody pays some guy and gets a chicken, and somebody pays, you pay money and you get body parts, So your lived experience is as a commodity. I think the connections between what you do and, what I do are so incredibly overlapping. It's sort of like you think, Jesus, does anybody not see this? But a lot of people don't see it. A lot of women don't see it.
I know I could just sit here and talk with you all day because I agree with you. And I think you're just a fascinating lecturer and, communicator. But I do want to kind of wrap up, well, two things. First, I want to ask you, well, I should say lastly, I want to ask you kind of what gives you hope, what keeps you grounded, all those things. But before that, we've kind of talked a bit about abolition versus harm reduction, but I kept on saying I'd come back to it. So I think there's a lot of people probably listening who still would think, well, okay, meatless Monday. If I don't eat animals one day of the week, or if I only eat dairy products, but I don't eat the animal themselves, or if whatever type of justification for that harm reduction model, which is the same thing that we see in sexual exploitation. Well, if I go to the indoor brothels where the women are licensed and I don't go to the street corners, well, then I'm not part of the problem, or I'm helping to reduce what is the problem. So in a nutshell, I guess, what would be the main argument of why we need full abolition versus these harm reduction? And is there still a place for harm reduction amid our pursuit of full abolition?
No, because you'll never get full abolition if you don't work for full abolition. So to the extent that you're promoting harm reduction, that's where you're going to stay. So if you tell yourself, I'm actually doing something socially useful by patronizing unionized prostitutes or something, no, you're not. You want to help out? Let's have an equal society where these women don't have to choose to do that, because women are not going to choose to do that. If they have options, they're not going to choose to do that. So meatless Monday. So instead you eat dairy. That's so nonsensical. Dairy is every bit as bad as meat. And what sort of moral campaign has you saying, let's not rape people on Mondays? Let's have rape-free Monday. I mean, most people would say, well, that's really screwed up. Well, it's really screwed up to say meat-free Monday. Meat-free Monday still allows an enormous amount of violent exploitation. It's a way of how we conceptualize moral issues. Are these issues that we can address by supposedly incrementally reducing harm? Or are these issues that we have to address by getting to their root issues, their foundational issues, and sort of saying, this is wrong? You can say, well, less harm is better than more harm. So there may be some aspects in which unionized prostitution is less violent than street prostitution, but that doesn't make it right. The fact that less harm is better than more harm doesn't mean that less harm is an acceptable situation or less harm is a desirable situation. We have to ask ourselves, is the activity wrong? If the activity is wrong, you just ought not to participate in it. You don't hire them off the street and you don't go into the unionized brothel. We're living in a society where people say, well, you can't take hard positions on things. You can't take black and white positions on things. My response to that is, screw that. That's wrong. Of course you can. You have an obligation to take black and white positions when there's a right and there's a wrong, where fundamental rights are being violated. This is a question of whose fundamental rights can we ignore? And the answer is we shouldn't ignore anyone's fundamental rights. And when we address violations of fundamental rights, it ought not to be from a standpoint of let's do less harm. It's let's stop the activity. And if you don't have the moral courage to do that, then
step aside.
Step aside. I'll do it for you.
Yeah, well, and I think so much of this work, both your work and my work, is really challenging these concepts of inevitability. And also, I think, if not that, challenging defeatism, where people just, think, well, world's oldest profession, or humans have always ate meat. It's really kind of moving the needle and trying to challenge people to strive and aim for higher. And I like people that do that. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to you and your work, because you have the fire in the belly. And I think we need more people that live with passion, right?
Always. And I do this in the face of complete pessimism.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm completely pessimistic about the result, but my view is, hey, what the hell? It's like I got to get up in the morning. If I'm not going to jump off of the roof, what am I going to do? I mean, what am I going to do? Am I going to sort of try to make it a better place? And the answer is, yeah. That's the only thing to do. If you're not going to jump off the roof and you're not going to just suck air and waste time, then try to make it a better place. And I think in many ways, my situation is complicated. The animal situation is complicated. Your situation is also complicated because you're fighting a particular sort of institutionalized exploitation of women. But the problem is that's against the context, against the background of even the non-institutional exploitation of women. It's like, yeah, prostitution is bad. But how much of our social institutions mimic prostitution in one way or another? It's the most obvious form of commodification of women. It ain't the only form of commodification of women. And it still is the case that if you're a well-off male, it doesn't matter how old you are, how unattractive you are, what a horrible person you are, you can still have the babe on your arm because that's the way it works. And until we sort of change that, but we only change that if we really take equality of women seriously, so that none of you, or at least most of you, are not economically dependent on us. That is the ultimate problem, that you are economically dependent on us. So how many women put up with abuse because they got kids and they don't have the money to leave? I would imagine that's a ubiquitous paradigm. Women who can't leave because they can't afford to leave. In certain ways, your issue is a very big issue. But my issue, I stand no chance as long as your issue is not focused on more, where it's not recognized how we deal with women. As I say, I get up every day and I say, it's amazing they haven't killed us all. It's just amazing. You're 50% of the world. You haven't killed us yet. And it's just amazing to me. It's a miracle. But until your situation is crystallized more, and more people understand, more people are outraged by pornography and the fact that kids can get access to this crap. This morning, something came out in Britain. Some young woman was killed, and they had an inquiry, and they concluded that the criminal justice system doesn't take violence to women as seriously as it takes other crimes. And I posted this saying, what a surprise. This is just shocking that, crimes against women are not taken as seriously. Why is that? Well, that's because, the police engage in those sorts of activities. The judges are, is this a surprise? And I find it sort of remarkable that this is like a headline on the Sky News website, that crimes against women, sexual crimes against women, are not taken seriously. And the answer is, well, isn't that surprising? I never would have thought that.
No, it's all true. And I've soaked up everything that you said. And it's just very reaffirming to me in the work that I do, to know that someone else sees the bigger picture, understands the struggles of any form of activism that's rooted in trying to create a more just, equal society. And I just really want to thank you for all your work. And I know, like I said, I could keep you on here all day. And I think, we've already gone over 2 hours. And I'm like, oh no. But
you know what? What's really funny is, I know we've gone over 2 hours because I can read the clock, but it doesn't seem like that at all. It's just like been breezing through. I want to leave you with one thought. You asked before, you said, how do you deal with all of this? And the answer is, I have some advice to give you. Just don't give a shit. Just don't care. I mean, it's just like, I don't care. Let them say what they want to say. If it gets too bad, I'll sue them for defamation.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
People are always going to snipe. People are always going to say horrible things. And the answer is, you got a job to do. I always look at it this way, Andrea. I always consider myself real lucky that I see what I see and think the way I think, because the alternative would be that I was sitting around, drinking beer and watching sporting events and not caring at all. I'm not saying that people who drink beer and watch sporting events don't care. I'm just saying I would be into sort of the male ritual sorts of behaviors. I consider myself so fortunate that I think this way. And you ought to be that way, because you came from a situation, and many people would not have seen what you saw. In other words, they would have had the same experiences, but they wouldn't have seen it. They wouldn't have understood what they were seeing.
The awakening, so to speak.
The awakening, the moral awakening. I always consider myself, man, geez, I am so happy that I am leading this ostensibly miserable life, fighting with people about stuff that I can't convince them of. But I don't feel that way. I look at every day as an opportunity for me to go out there, whether I'm doing a podcast or a lecture or just shopping at the store and people asking me about my 27 heads of kale. I look at it as an opportunity to engage, an opportunity to sort of reach out to another human being and give them the gift that I got years ago. When I walked into that slaughterhouse, I was a big meat eater. My father was in the food service industry. I didn't know what a vegetable was. I also grew up at a time when eating meat was a socioeconomic thing. And so I grew up in that time and came from, my grandparents were not from this country. If you had told me when I was 16 years old, one day you're going to be a vegan and this, you're going to be into nonviolence theory and you're going to be, I would have thought, first of all, I would not have known what a vegan was, but if you explained it to me, I would have thought you were insane. And so when I think about where I came from, it's not that I came from a background where there was a lot of focus on these social justice issues. There really wasn't. I mean, it came from a middle class. My dad worked very, very hard. My mom stayed home, took care of us, that sort of stuff. And then I walked into a slaughterhouse one day and my whole world changed. My whole world changed. Everything changed. I walked out of there with a different brain and a different set of eyes. And now it took me a couple of years to go vegan because I didn't know. And I remember thinking if you didn't eat any animal protein, you would die.
Yeah. I think we all thought that at one point.
And when I first became a vegan, I actually thought it would be not good for my health, but that I thought it would be good for my spiritual health, but not maybe for my physical health. But that was okay because who I was as a human being was more important than how long I lived or what, et cetera. I mean, if somebody told me today you need to eat meat because it's good for your health, I wouldn't do it. I mean, even if they proved it to me, I wouldn't do it. It might be good for my physical health. I don't believe it is at all. But if somebody were to convince me, I still wouldn't do it. And so I consider myself really fortunate. And you should consider yourself fortunate because you know what? If things went a different way, you could right now be like sitting in Canada, the head of a whole chain of unionized brothels. And you could, you could be arguing and saying, look, who the hell are you to say this is not women's consent and blah, 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 blah. So be grateful that you came away with your spirit intact, indeed strengthened. That's what I think you should think about it.
That is so beautiful. And I love that you said that. And I'm grateful that you said that because I have had people say to me, oh, they always come on the pity party, which, I appreciate that they can see the problem in exploitation, but I have a very hard time with people pitying me because I think that way as well. I think, it sucked to go through 7 years in prostitution. But one, I compare myself to some of the very, very, very horrible experiences, even though I agree with you, it's all violent, it's all exploitation, it's all horrible. There are women who did have it worse than me, with regular beatings and all these things, right? But I often tell people, as bad as 7 years of prostitution was, I'm grateful for the experience. And that might sound very oxymoronic to say that you're grateful for harm. But I always say, if I hadn't gone through that, I don't think I could understand the gravity of the harm that happens in that system. And I don't think I'd be as good of an advocate for the women who are still trapped in it if I couldn't bring forth that raw truth of it. And if it was, as you said, just kind of in that intellectual space of not really feeling it, but knowing it still the same. And it has been a gift. I mean, it obviously has its cursing moments as well, too, like when you have the lingering nightmares or the so-called flashbacks and things like that. But it is a gift. And I think knowledge is always a gift, whether it's dark knowledge or beautiful, bright knowledge. And I definitely also had a spiritual awakening once I went vegan, too. And that's actually what I talk to people the most about when I discuss veganism. Aside from the moral issue of the animals and how they're treated, I always say, something changed in me. There was something that caused me a spiritual ascension that I cannot put into words. And I think it was just getting onto the right path of not causing harm to anybody in my life insofar as I could possibly do that. And what a gift it is to live a life where you can say, I am not harming people, and you can feel good about the choices that you make every day, whether that's what you're eating or consuming in media, by not watching pornography. It's a whole new way of living. And if someone would have told me, 15, 20 years ago, this will be your life, you'll be a vegan anti-prostitution advocate, same thing, I would have been like, no, definitely not. That's not me, right? I grew up in a home with a father who was a hunter and still is a hunter, unfortunately. But, it was so far from where I thought I would ever end up. But I'm really grateful to be here in the here and now.
If you think about it, you were part of a generation that completely distorted the concept of consent and that pushed feminism in a very, very, very pathological direction. And you were able to escape that. And I agree with you on this. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I do believe very strongly in the principle of nonviolence, very, very strongly. And I feel that I try to sort of live that every day. In terms of how I interact with people as well, I don't call people murderers, who are eating animals. I don't yell at them or scream at them. I think that's nonsense. I try to talk with everybody. If I have a conversation with some guys about pornography, I don't call them perverts or whatever. I just say, look, think about it. Just think about it. Your conduct assumes a certain set of values. That is, your conduct assumes the value that it's all right to be entertained by harming others. Well, but those women make money. No, yeah, right. They make money. But do you understand what's going on there? Do you understand the violence that's going on there? Do you understand that the only reason why they're choosing to commodify themselves, assuming that they're not psychologically messed up, which many of them probably are, because I do not understand how any woman makes it to 18 sane. Really, I just don't understand because, you're so constantly bombarded with what you're supposed to be as a woman, as a girl. But look, keep fighting the fight, kid. Keep fighting the fight, and that's the only choice you've got, because however unhappy it makes you, you'd be 10,000 times unhappier if you sort of gave it up to, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to become an Edmonton housewife.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the kids to soccer practice, and you would hate yourself. So be happy.
That's true. I've got to keep the fire in the belly, and watching people like you who have it and who have forged the path, it really gives me good footsteps to follow in and a good model to follow of how to keep the sanity over so many years of activism and still sit here laughing and having a good chat about it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And let me know when this is going to be available so I can post it and then have lots of people yell at me. And it's fine.
We'll team up and get everyone mad at us together.
Yeah, exactly. And that's perfectly fine. God bless them. Let them get angry. Anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to tag your new book, and we'll be sure to tag your X profile so that people can chase you down, all the hate followers that I might have that don't know about you yet, and vice versa.
Exactly. They can say all sorts of horrible things about me, and that's fine.
So thanks again, Professor. Really appreciate having you on. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.